Marcus, step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them.
What's this about?
I'm just reporting for duty. We tracked that container from the port to this location.
I don't know anything about a container.
For nearly 11 years, Marcus Reed was a trusted harbor patrol officer with access to restricted waterways and secure cargo zones. But investigators would soon uncover evidence suggesting the very system he was sworn to protect had become central to a sophisticated smuggling operation.
Black Harbor Patrol Officer Marcus Reed, you're under arrest.
By the spring of 2025, Marcus Reed had spent nearly 11 years working the waterfront. At 38 years old, the Black Harbor Patrol officer had become a familiar face throughout the Port of Hampton Bay, one of the busiest commercial shipping hubs on the East Coast. Supervisors trusted him. Dock workers knew him by name. Security contractors recognized his patrol boat long before it came into view. In a place where thousands of people moved through secure areas every week, familiarity carried weight. The port stretched across several miles of shoreline. Massive container cranes towered over the harbor. Cargo vessels arrived from Europe, South America, and Asia around the clock. On busy days, more than 6,000 shipping containers could pass through the facility. Millions of dollars in goods moved through the port every week. Everything depended on security. Every gate access, vessel movement, cargo inspection, and restricted zone entry generated records somewhere in the system, or at least it was supposed to. Marcus's job placed him in the middle of it all. As a harbor patrol officer, his responsibilities included vessel inspections, restricted waterway enforcement, cargo escort operations, emergency response coordination, and monitoring secure maritime zones. He spent most shifts moving between patrol boats, security checkpoints, and operations, offices illuminated by aging fluorescent lights and rows of surveillance monitors. The work required independence. Officers often operated alone for long periods. Trust wasn't optional. It was built into the system, and few employees had earned more of it than Marcus Reed. Personnel records showed consistent performance reviews. Supervisors described him as dependable, professional, and calm under pressure. He volunteered for overtime assignments. He covered shifts when staffing shortages emerged. During severe weather incidents, he routinely stayed beyond scheduled hours. Those decisions earned him something increasingly valuable inside the department: access. Over time, Marcus received expanded security credentials allowing him to move through multiple restricted zones without requiring additional approvals. He could access marine staging areas, inspection docks, vessel checkpoints, and administrative facilities that most employees rarely entered. Nobody viewed that as unusual. He had earned it. At least that's how it appeared. Co-workers later described Marcus as reserved but approachable. He wasn't known for drawing attention to himself. During shift briefings, he usually sat quietly while supervisors reviewed assignments. When conversations turned personal, he often listened more than he spoke. There was nothing about his behavior that suggested he would eventually become the focus of a DORJ, federal investigation. That was precisely what made the situation so difficult to recognize. The first warning signs were subtle. So subtle that nobody treated them as warnings at all. Around the middle of 2024, scheduling coordinators noticed Marcus repeatedly requesting certain overnight patrol assignments. The requests weren't against policy. Senior officers often had preferences regarding patrol sectors. Still, the pattern stood out. Marcus seemed unusually interested in routes covering specific cargo transfer zones near the eastern shipping terminals. The requests were approved. Nobody gave them a second thought. Several months later, a marine operations supervisor noticed Marcus had exchanged assignments with another officer 3 times in a single month. Again, there was nothing technically improper about the changes. Shift swaps happened regularly throughout the department. The explanation was simple. Marcus claimed the schedule worked better for family obligations. The paperwork was approved. The issue disappeared, or at least it appeared to. Elsewhere in the port, small administrative irregularities were beginning to surface. Security logs occasionally reflected checkpoint entries that lacked corresponding inspection notes. Certain cargo escorts appeared incomplete within the reporting system. Minor documentation gaps emerged during routine audits. Most were corrected within hours. A missing signature here, an incomplete report there. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal. Just the kind of bureaucratic mistakes that happen inside large organizations processing enormous amounts of information every day. But those small discrepancies shared something investigators would only recognize much later. Many occurred during Marcus Reed's shifts. At the time, Nobody connected the dots. The port's security infrastructure generated millions of data points every month. Access records, radio communications, gate scans, vessel tracking logs, cargo manifests, inspection reports, and surveillance footage poured continuously into databases, maintained by different departments. No single person saw everything. And because nobody was looking for a problem, nobody noticed a pattern. The system relied heavily on trust. Trust in employees. Trust in procedures. Trust that experienced personnel would follow the rules, even when nobody was watching. Marcus benefited from that trust more than most. By early 2025, supervisors rarely questioned his movements inside the port. If his access card appeared in a restricted zone, there was usually an assumption he belonged there. If he requested a patrol adjustment, approval often came with little discussion. The confidence people had in him became part of his professional identity. Then something happened that had nothing to do with Marcus at all. A customs inspection team conducting a routine examination of incoming cargo flagged a shipping container arriving from overseas. The discrepancy initially appeared administrative. Documentation associated with the shipment didn't match information stored in the port's logistics network. Inspectors expected a paperwork error. Instead, the deeper they looked, the stranger the shipment became. According to multiple records, that container should never have been inside the port's distribution system in the first place. And when officials began retracing its path through the harbor, they unknowingly stepped onto the trail of something much larger. But investigators soon realized the suspicious shipment was only the beginning of a much larger problem. The container should never have been there. What began as a routine customs inspection inside Warehouse Complex C near Pier 14 quickly became something else entirely. Inspectors reviewing inbound cargo records noticed that a 40-foot shipping container, listed in the port's logistics database, carried tracking information that didn't match its accompanying paperwork. At first, nobody seemed particularly alarmed. Administrative discrepancies happened regularly inside the Port of Hampton Bay. Every day, thousands of containers moved between terminals, staging yards, inspection areas, and outbound transportation routes. Documentation errors, delayed updates, and contractor mistakes were frustrating but common. Realities of operating one of the busiest shipping facilities on the East Coast. The initial assumption was simple. Someone had entered incorrect information. A customs compliance specialist submitted an internal review request and expected the issue to be resolved by the end of the day. Instead, the discrepancy grew stranger. According to electronic tracking records, the container had entered the port through Gate 7 3 days earlier. Surveillance timestamps confirmed the entry. Vehicle identification scans matched. Security approvals appeared valid. Yet the shipping manifest attached to the container belonged to an entirely different cargo. Movement scheduled for the following week. The records contradicted each other, and nobody could immediately explain why. The matter was forwarded to customs investigator Robert Hastings, a veteran analyst who had spent nearly 15 years reviewing cargo irregularities. Sitting beneath fluorescent office lighting inside the Customs Administration building, overlooking Harbor Drive, Hastings began comparing digital records from multiple databases. What he expected to find was a clerical mistake. What he found instead was a pattern. Several previous cargo discrepancies shared unusually similar characteristics. Containers appeared where they should not have been. Inspection records were incomplete. Tracking logs contained small inconsistencies. Each issue had been resolved individually and closed without further review. Viewed separately, none appeared significant. Viewed together, they raised uncomfortable questions. By the second week of the review, Hastings requested assistance from internal port security analysts. The request remained informal. No criminal investigation had been opened. Not yet. Inside the Port Security Operations Center, analysts began pulling archived gate activity records. Large surveillance monitors displayed vessel movements while radio traffic echoed quietly from dispatch speakers overhead. Employees reviewed spreadsheets, timestamp logs, and checkpoint reports stretching back nearly 18 months. The deeper they looked, the more unusual details emerged. Several containers associated with documentation discrepancies had passed through restricted checkpoints during overnight hours, when cargo activity was typically reduced. That alone wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. Shipping schedules often required late-night operations. But another detail stood out. The same patrol assignments appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Black Harbor Patrol Officer Marcus Reed's name surfaced again and again. Initially, investigators treated the overlap as coincidence. Marcus worked a substantial amount of overtime, His seniority gave him access to specialized patrol routes, covering large portions of the harbor. Statistically, his presence in security records wasn't surprising. Still, analysts noted the connection. Then another discrepancy appeared. A restricted vehicle gate near Eastern Maritime Terminal had been opened at 2:17 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Access records showed proper authorization. The electronic system reflected an approved security clearance. But investigators could not locate the supporting paperwork required to justify the opening. The approval existed. The documentation did not. That detail was logged. Several days later, analysts found another incident. A cargo escort assignment had been completed according to operational records, yet portions of the accompanying inspection report were missing. Signatures had not been entered. Verification fields remained blank. Again, Marcus Reed had been assigned to the patrol zone during the movement. Again, investigators lacked evidence connecting him directly to any violation. The situation remained frustratingly incomplete. By late summer, customs officials, surveillance analysts, and port security personnel began quietly sharing information. Nobody wanted rumors spreading through the department. If there was a legitimate explanation, confronting employees too early could compromise any future inquiry. Instead, investigators focused on records. The records couldn't become defensive. The records couldn't forget conversations. The records simply reflected activity, and increasingly, the activity appeared unusual. Radio communications added another layer. Reviewers listening to archived dispatch recordings noticed occasional patrol deviations, involving vessel locations that were never fully explained. The transmissions themselves sounded routine. Officers requested position updates. Dispatchers acknowledged assignments. Harbor traffic continued normally. Nothing sounded suspicious. Yet when analysts compared radio logs against vessel tracking records, certain route adjustments lacked obvious operational justification. Most involved overnight periods. Most occurred near cargo transfer corridors, and many coincided with shifts worked by Black Marcus Reed. Even then, investigators remained cautious. Patterns alone were not proof. Large organizations naturally produce coincidences. People see connections where none exist. Every investigator involved understood that risk. The last thing anyone wanted was to falsely accuse a respected officer based on incomplete information. So, the review expanded. Additional months of records were examined. Gate access activity was compared against vessel movement data. Security approvals were matched against supporting documentation. Cargo routing records were cross-referenced with surveillance timestamps. Gradually, isolated incidents stopped looking isolated. Instead, they began forming a timeline. One discrepancy led to another. A missing inspection record connected to an unusual gate opening. An unusual gate opening connected to a vessel movement. A vessel movement connected to a patrol assignment. Each connection remained circumstantial, but the accumulation was becoming difficult to ignore. Inside conference rooms and administrative offices throughout the port, investigators quietly discussed possibilities they had previously dismissed. Software errors seemed less likely. Clerical mistakes failed to explain recurring patterns. Random coincidence became increasingly difficult to defend. Yet there was still a critical problem. No witness had reported misconduct. No surveillance footage showed criminal activity. No direct evidence linked Marcus Reed to wrongdoing. All investigators had were questions, and those questions were growing. Then analysts completed the first comprehensive timeline. What they discovered within that chronology would force the port to take a step it had hoped to avoid. A covert surveillance operation was about to begin. The completed timeline changed the entire investigation. Until that point, customs officials and port administrators had been dealing with what appeared to be a series of administrative irregularities. Missing paperwork, unusual gate activity, incomplete escort records. Individually, each issue could be explained away. Together, they formed something investigators could no longer ignore. Within days, a joint task force was assembled. The group operated quietly from offices inside the Federal Maritime Security Building on Thanuli Harbor Drive. Representatives from Customs Enforcement, Port Security, Maritime Investigations, and federal law enforcement began meeting behind closed doors. Most employees inside the port never knew the meetings were happening. The objective was simple: determine whether the growing patterns surrounding Black Harbor Patrol Officer Marcus Reed reflected negligence, misconduct, or something far more serious. Investigators agreed on one rule immediately. Marcus could not know he was being monitored. If the concerns proved unfounded, they would avoid damaging the reputation of a respected officer. If the concerns were justified, alerting him too early could compromise the investigation. The task force chose surveillance. Not dramatic surveillance. Not hidden agents following vehicles through city streets. Instead, they relied on records, cameras, timestamps, and movement data. The kinds of evidence people unknowingly create every day. Additional security cameras were redirected toward cargo transfer corridors that had appeared repeatedly within the timeline review. Analysts requested expanded access to vessel tracking systems. GPS records from harbor patrol boats were archived and preserved. Weeks passed. Then the first significant pattern emerged. Marcus's patrol assignments consistently overlapped with cargo movements that later generated documentation concerns. The overlap was not constant, but it occurred often enough to attract attention. Inside the operations center, analysts sat beneath the glow of surveillance monitors, comparing vessel routes against shift schedules. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet produced the same result. The names of other officers appeared occasionally. Marcus appeared repeatedly. Investigators remained cautious. Patterns created suspicion. They did not establish criminal intent. Still, the review continued. Access card data became the next focus. Every secured location inside the port required electronic credentials. Officers used access cards to enter marine facilities, security checkpoints, administrative offices, and restricted operational zones. Reviewing months of records revealed another concern. Marcus's ES credentials occasionally appeared in locations unrelated to his assigned patrol areas. The incidents were infrequent. Sometimes only a few minutes separated the access event from a legitimate assignment nearby. But investigators struggled to identify clear operational reasons for several of the entries. Questions accumulated. Answers did not. The atmosphere inside the task force meetings began changing. Early discussions centered around procedural explanations. Later discussions focused on possibilities nobody had initially wanted to consider. One federal investigator reportedly summarized the situation during a briefing. "We keep finding smoke." The room remained quiet, because everyone understood the implication. The problem was that nobody had located the fire. Radio communications provided another piece of the puzzle. Analysts reviewed weeks of archived dispatch recordings. Hours passed inside small review rooms, where the steady hum of HVAC systems mixed with radio, chatter, and keyboard clicks. Most recordings sounded routine. Harbor patrol units requested position updates. Dispatchers assigned calls. Vessel operators reported normal traffic conditions. Nothing appeared alarming. Then route comparisons revealed inconsistencies. Marcus occasionally reported patrol positions that technically complied with assignment requirements, but placed him unusually close to locations associated with previous cargo. Discrepancies. The deviations were subtle, small enough to avoid immediate attention, large enough to raise concern when viewed collectively. The task force documented every occurrence. By early autumn, investigators expanded their inquiry beyond digital records. Witness interviews began. Carefully, informally. A dock worker employed at Eastern Maritime Terminal recalled seeing cargo transfers occurring unusually late at night near a restricted staging area. When interviewed, he appeared uncertain. He admitted he hadn't reported the activity because nothing had seemed obviously wrong at the time. Ports operated 24 hours a day. Late-night work was common. Yet one detail stood out. The worker remembered seeing a harbor patrol vessel nearby during at least 2 of the transfers. Months later, he identified Marcus's vessel number from photographs shown during the investigation. Another witness provided a similar observation. A tugboat operator who routinely assisted incoming cargo vessels described seeing escort activity near a secondary transfer point where official operations were rarely conducted. When investigators asked whether he remembered who was operating the patrol vessel, he hesitated. "I think it was Reed," he eventually said. "I'm not 100% sure. But I remember thinking it was unusual." Neither witness could establish criminal conduct. Neither claimed to have observed illegal cargo. But their statements reinforced concerns already developing inside the task force. More importantly, both observations aligned with surveillance data. By November, investigators had accumulated thousands of pages of records. The evidence remained circumstantial. No surveillance footage captured Marcus participating in a smuggling operation. No witness directly implicated him. No physical evidence connected him to criminal activity. The investigation appeared trapped. Then analysts reviewing communication records discovered something unexpected. During a broader examination of maritime contact data, several recurring phone numbers, appeared alongside dates associated with suspicious cargo activity. Initially, the numbers meant nothing. Analysts dug deeper. Subscriber information connected the contacts to individuals already known to federal investigators through unrelated smuggling inquiries conducted outside the harbor. The discovery triggered immediate concern. Investigators began comparing communication activity against vessel movements, patrol schedules, and gate access records. The correlations were difficult to ignore. Repeated contact occurred before and after several suspicious cargo transfers, sometimes hours before, sometimes minutes. The pattern extended across multiple months. For the first time, investigators possessed evidence suggesting that the irregularities inside the port might not be isolated administrative failures. They could be connected to an organized network operating beyond the harbor itself. The investigation immediately changed direction. What had begun as an internal security review now carried the potential elements of criminal conspiracy. Federal resources expanded. Case files grew larger. Meetings became more frequent. And for the first time, investigators seriously discussed the possibility that Marcus Reed was not acting alone. Yet despite months of surveillance, interviews, tracking data, access records, and communication analysis, one critical problem remained. They still lacked direct evidence proving Marcus knowingly participated in the movement of illegal cargo. Without that proof, there would be no arrest, and obtaining it would require investigators to take their biggest risk yet. The breakthrough came from a source investigators had learned to take seriously. Late in the evening, a federal analyst assigned to the task force received information suggesting that another unauthorized cargo movement was scheduled to occur within the next 48 hours. The details were incomplete. There was no confirmed container number, no verified shipment manifest, no clear description of the cargo
What
investigators did have was timing, and timing was enough. For months, the task force had been building a picture of how suspicious movements appeared to occur. Certain routes, certain hours, certain security procedures that seemed to be bypassed without immediately triggering alarms. Now they had an opportunity to observe the process in real time. The response was coordinated carefully. Harbor patrol supervisors were briefed behind closed doors. Federal agents reviewed surveillance assignments. Customs enforcement personnel prepared documentation teams. Maritime surveillance units were positioned at observation points overlooking key sections of the harbor. Nobody wanted to move too early. The objective was evidence, not intervention. Shortly before midnight, activity inside the port appeared routine. Container cranes continued operating along the waterfront. Cargo trucks entered and exited through designated checkpoints. Dispatch channels carried the usual stream of radio traffic. Security guards checked credentials at access gates illuminated by bright industrial lighting. Nothing seemed unusual. Inside the Joint Operations Center, however, dozens of investigators watched live data feeds. GPS tracking systems displayed vessel locations across the harbor. Security cameras streamed footage from loading zones, transfer points, and restricted waterways. Large digital maps covered conference room screens. The atmosphere was quiet. Nobody wanted to speculate. Everyone understood the importance of what might happen next. At 12:43 a.m., Marcus Reed's patrol vessel departed its assigned sector. The movement was subtle, not dramatic enough to attract attention from someone casually reviewing harbor activity. But investigators noticed immediately. According to patrol schedules, Marcus had been assigned to a different monitoring area on the western side of the port. Instead, GPS records showed his vessel gradually moving east. Analysts documented the deviation. No conclusions were drawn. Not yet. Several minutes later, another vessel entered a restricted harbor corridor near an industrial transfer zone that had appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. The vessel's movement was unusual. The route itself was technically accessible. The timing was not. The area experienced very little traffic during overnight hours. Investigators continued watching. Radio transmissions remained calm. Marcus communicated normally with dispatch. His tone never changed. Nothing in his voice suggested concern. Nothing indicated he knew he was being monitored. Inside the operations center, timestamps were logged continuously. Every movement was recorded. Every transmission was archived. Every access event was documented. At 1:18 a.m., surveillance teams observed activity near a restricted docking point adjacent to an inactive cargo staging area. The location was significant. Investigators had previously linked the area to multiple irregular shipping records. For months, however, They had lacked direct observation. Tonight was different. Marine surveillance personnel positioned along the shoreline reported vessel activity near the dock. Camera operators adjusted zoom settings. Analysts tracked coordinates in real time. The operation was unfolding exactly where investigators hoped it would. Then another critical development occurred. Electronic access logs showed a security checkpoint opening near the transfer zone. The authorization appeared valid. The problem was that investigators could find no corresponding inspection request, no approved movement order, no documented operational justification. The gate had opened, but according to official records, nothing should have been passing through it. The discrepancy immediately drew attention. Minutes later, investigators observed cargo being moved through the area. The transfer appeared organized. Personnel involved behaved as though the movement had been approved. Yet documentation teams reviewing port records could not locate the required inspection paperwork. For the first time, the task force was watching a suspicious cargo movement occur while simultaneously verifying that key authorization records were missing. The significance was impossible to ignore. As the operation continued, Marcus's patrol vessel remained nearby. GPS data confirmed his position. Video footage captured the vessel's movements. Surveillance teams documented timing, routes, and proximity to the transfer activity. Individually, each piece of evidence might have been explained away. Together, they created something investigators had been seeking for months. Direct documentation. Not assumptions. Not patterns. Not theories. Evidence. Inside the operations center, the mood changed noticeably. Investigators who had spent months reviewing spreadsheets and historical records were now watching events unfold in real time. One customs supervisor later described the atmosphere as strangely quiet. There was no celebration, no dramatic reaction, just the realization that the investigation had crossed an important threshold. As the cargo movement concluded, analysts immediately began preserving records. Video files were secured. GPS logs were archived. Radio communications were downloaded and stored. Access control data was copied into evidence repositories. Every detail mattered. Investigators understood that future court proceedings would depend on accuracy. The burden of proof remained high. By 3 o'clock m.m., preliminary evidence summaries were already being prepared. Federal agents reviewed surveillance reports. Customs officials assembled documentation packages. Port security administrators began discussing internal disciplinary procedures. The focus of the investigation had shifted. For months, investigators had been trying to determine whether suspicious activity existed. Now they were evaluating potential criminal charges. As darkness slowly gave way to the first signs of morning, meetings continued inside government offices throughout the harbor complex. Computer screens remained illuminated. Printers produced stacks of reports. Investigators compared timelines one final time. The evidence was no longer pointing toward isolated administrative failures. It pointed toward deliberate conduct. And before the sun fully rose over the harbor, task force members began preparing the documents that would change Marcus Reed's life. By sunrise, the trusted officer who once protected the port had become the target of a federal arrest operation. By sunrise, the investigation had moved beyond surveillance. The evidence gathered overnight was already being reviewed by prosecutors, federal agents, and customs officials. Inside conference rooms overlooking the harbor, stacks of reports covered tables. Surveillance screenshots were printed and labeled. GPS records were organized into timelines. Access control logs were matched against vessel movements. For the first time since the investigation began, authorities believed they had enough evidence to act. Marcus Reed had no indication what was waiting for him. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., the Black Harbor Patrol officer arrived at the Port of Hampton Bay for what appeared to be another routine shift. Employees were beginning to filter through security checkpoints. Radio traffic echoed from dispatch offices. Cargo trucks rolled through inspection lanes as harbor operations gradually accelerated. For the day, several federal agents were already positioned nearby. They waited until Marcus entered a secured operations area adjacent to Pier 12. Then they approached. According to investigative reports, the lead agent identified himself and instructed Marcus to keep his hands visible. Witnesses later described the moment as strangely quiet. There was no chase. No confrontation, no dramatic scene, just confusion. Marcus initially appeared stunned. One employee recalled seeing him glance between the agents and nearby supervisors as though trying to understand whether some mistake had been made. When informed that he was being taken into custody as part of an ongoing federal investigation, Marcus reportedly responded with a brief pause before asking a simple question. "What is this about?" The answer came quickly. Investigators referenced evidence involving unauthorized cargo movements, restricted access violations, and activity connected to the previous night's operation. Marcus said little after that. Co-workers watched from doorways, loading areas, and administrative offices. For many of them, the arrest felt impossible. Marcus had spent more than a decade working alongside the same people. He attended safety meetings, covered shifts, participated in emergency responses. For years, he had been viewed as one of the department's most dependable officers. Several employees later admitted they struggled to process what they were seeing. Others reacted differently. Away from supervisors and investigators, some privately acknowledged that certain things had never fully made sense. The unusual schedule requests, the unexplained patrol adjustments, the repeated presence in areas unrelated to assigned duties. Individually, none of those observations seemed significant. Now they looked different. As Marcus was transported from the harbor, investigators executed multiple search warrants connected to the case. Federal agents entered offices, reviewed departmental records, and seized electronic devices believed to contain relevant information. Computers were imaged, phones were collected, storage drives were cataloged. Evidence technicians spent hours documenting every item removed from secured locations. The investigation was expanding rapidly. What had started as a review of suspicious cargo movements was becoming a broader examination of how the alleged operation functioned. Digital forensic specialists began reviewing communication records accumulated during the investigation. Months of call data, message activity, and contact histories were analyzed. Patterns investigators had previously identified through surveillance now appeared more substantial when viewed alongside communication records. Repeated contact emerged between Marcus and individuals already known to federal authorities through separate smuggling investigations. The timing of those communications drew particular attention. Many occurred before suspicious cargo movements. Others followed immediately afterward. Investigators believed the contacts helped establish coordination. Financial records created additional concerns. Subpoenaed banking information revealed transactions that investigators struggled to reconcile with Marcus's reported income. The amounts varied. None were individually extraordinary. Collectively, however, they attracted scrutiny. Several deposits lacked obvious explanations. Investigators examined account activity, payment histories, and financial transfers, looking for connections to individuals appearing elsewhere in the investigation. At the same time, analysts continued reconstructing vessel movements, GPS data, surveillance footage, dispatch records, and marine traffic logs were combined into increasingly detailed timelines. The result was a picture investigators believed demonstrated repeated coordination between harbor activity and suspicious cargo transfers. Prosecutors began preparing formal charges. Court filings alleged that Marcus knowingly participated in activities designed to move cargo through secure areas, while bypassing required inspection procedures. The allegations carried serious consequences: federal smuggling-related offenses, conspiracy allegations, violations connected to misuse of official authority. The investigation was no longer focused solely on policy violations. Authorities were preparing a criminal case. Marcus maintained his innocence. Through legal counsel, he disputed the allegations and denied knowingly participating in any illegal operation. Friends and family members publicly expressed support. Some described him as hard-working and dedicated. Others insisted investigators had misinterpreted routine professional activities. Those statements did little to slow the administrative response. Within days, Marcus was placed on suspension. The suspension quickly became termination. The department issued statements emphasizing accountability and public trust. Access credentials were revoked. Personnel records were updated. His career at the harbor effectively ended before any trial began. But investigators were beginning to confront a larger problem. The evidence suggested suspicious activity may have occurred over an extended period of time. If that was true, how had nobody stopped it sooner? Internal auditors were assigned to review security procedures. Supervisors were interviewed. Compliance records were examined. Attention shifted beyond Marcus himself and toward the systems responsible for detecting misconduct. Investigators wanted to know why unusual access activity had not triggered earlier warnings, why documentation discrepancies were repeatedly dismissed, Why oversight mechanisms failed to identify patterns that now appeared obvious in hindsight. The questions grew larger with every review, because by that point, the case was no longer only about one harbor patrol officer, it was about the institution that trusted him. And as prosecutors prepared for trial, an even bigger question emerged. How had the port's security system failed so completely? The questions surrounding the port's failures followed the case into federal court. Months after his arrest, Marcus Reed appeared before a grand jury and was formally indicted on the multiple charges connected to the alleged smuggling operation. By then, the investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports. Evidence binders filled entire shelves inside government offices. Surveillance files, communication records, financial documents, and maritime tracking logs had been organized into a case prosecutors believed demonstrated a long-running abuse of public trust. The proceedings attracted significant attention throughout the region. Current and former port employees attended hearings. Local media covered major developments. Industry officials watched closely because the allegations raised concerns extending far beyond a single harbor patrol officer. If the accusations were true, one trusted employee had allegedly exploited security systems designed to protect critical infrastructure. If they were false, an experienced officer faced the destruction of his career based on circumstantial evidence and interpretation. The trial became a test of both narratives. Inside the federal courthouse, prosecutors began constructing their case methodically. There were no dramatic revelations during opening statements. Instead, jurors were introduced to timelines, dates, records, movements. The government argued that Black Marcus Reed had repeatedly used his position to facilitate unauthorized cargo transfers while concealing activity behind legitimate security procedures. To support that claim, prosecutors relied heavily on surveillance evidence gathered throughout the investigation. Video footage showed patrol vessel locations during critical periods. Access control records documented entries into restricted areas. GPS tracking data established movement patterns that investigators believed aligned with suspicious cargo activity. None of the evidence existed in isolation. The prosecution's strategy depended on showing how separate pieces fit together. Witnesses became critical. Customs investigators explained how the original discrepancies were discovered during routine inspections. Surveillance analysts described reviewing months of security footage and electronic records. Federal agents walked jurors through communication data that allegedly connected Marcus to individuals already under scrutiny in unrelated smuggling investigations. The testimony was detailed, often technical, sometimes tedious, but prosecutors understood that complex cases are rarely won through dramatic moments. They are won through accumulation, one fact layered on top of another, then another, and another. Maritime security specialists were called to explain port operations. Using diagrams and facility maps, they described inspection requirements, restricted access protocols, vessel movement procedures, and cargo clearance systems. Jurors learned how shipping operations functioned and where investigators believed safeguards had been bypassed. Several former co-workers testified as well. Most appeared uncomfortable. Many had known Marcus for years. One supervisor described him as dependable and professional. Another acknowledged trusting him more than many officers under his command. Those statements unintentionally strengthened part of the prosecution's argument. Trust, prosecutors suggested, had become a vulnerability. The defense approached the case differently. Marcus's attorneys did not deny that suspicious activity occurred inside the port. Instead, they challenged the interpretation of the evidence. Access records, they argued, proved presence, but not criminal intent. GPS data established location, but not participation. Communication records demonstrated contact, but not conspiracy. Again and again, defense attorneys emphasized the difference between suspicion and proof. During cross-examination, investigators were questioned about assumptions embedded within portions of the timeline analysis. Analysts were asked whether alternative explanations existed for certain vessel movements. Witnesses were challenged on memory. Some admitted uncertainty regarding events they had observed months earlier. Others acknowledged gaps in documentation. The defense focused heavily on those gaps. Reasonable doubt became the central theme. Marcus himself remained largely expressionless throughout much of the trial. Observers described him as calm but distant. He frequently took notes. Occasionally he leaned toward his attorneys during testimony, but for most proceedings, he sat quietly and listened. Weeks passed. Evidence continued accumulating. By the time closing arguments arrived, Jurors had reviewed surveillance footage, vessel tracking data, financial records, communication histories, internal reports, and witness testimonies spanning months of investigation. The emotional center of the case had shifted. The trial was no longer only about cargo, or paperwork, or vessel routes. It was about trust. Prosecutors argued that Marcus had exploited authority granted to him by the public and by the institution he served. Defense attorneys argued that investigators had assembled a theory and then interpreted ordinary events through that lens. The jury was left to decide which explanation was more credible. Deliberations lasted several days. When jurors returned, the courtroom became noticeably still. Chair movements stopped. Conversations ended. Reporters lowered their pens. Marcus looked forward. The verdict was read. Jurors found him guilty on multiple charges connected to the smuggling scheme. Several family members lowered their heads. One former coworker stared at the floor. Federal investigators who had spent months building the case remained restrained. There were no visible celebrations, only relief. The sentencing hearing followed weeks later. By then, prosecutors were focused on consequences. They argued that the conduct created security risks extending beyond financial harm. Smuggling through protected infrastructure threatened confidence in systems designed to safeguard commerce, transportation, and public safety. The judge echoed many of those concerns. During sentencing remarks, attention repeatedly returned to trust, the authority granted to public employees, the responsibility accompanying access to restricted facilities, the damage caused when those privileges are abused. The judge also addressed institutional credibility, noting that public confidence depends on accountability when misconduct occurs. Marcus spoke briefly before sentencing. His remarks were measured. He maintained that he never intended to harm the port or the people who worked there. While acknowledging the seriousness of the situation, he continued disputing portions of the government's interpretation of events. Moments later, the sentence was imposed. The courtroom remained quiet. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Some community members viewed the outcome as a necessary example of accountability. Others questioned whether broader institutional failures had received enough scrutiny. Those concerns would not disappear. In the months following sentencing, the Port of Hampton Bay implemented significant reforms. Access control systems were upgraded. Audit procedures became more frequent. Restricted area authorizations required additional review. Random inspections increased. Vessel tracking oversight expanded. Departments that once operated independently were required to share data more consistently. The changes reflected a difficult lesson. Technology had not failed. Policies had not entirely failed. People had failed to question what appeared trustworthy, and that realization ultimately became the most important outcome of the entire investigation. Because in the end, investigators weren't just uncovering a smuggling operation. They were exposing how a system built on trust failed to recognize the danger standing inside it.